We have our panelists, so we're ready to get started. If you guys want to come back and take your seats. All right, so I'm going to moderate, but let me make a quick introduction. I'll let everybody kind of give a background themselves. So on the panel, from your right to left, Michael Ducy, Director of Community for Sysdig. Welcome. Daniel Messer, who's Product Manager over at Red Hat. And then I have Josh Resso, who's a Staff Field Engineer for VMware. Welcome. All right, so I want this to be a little interactive. I have some topics I've shared with the panelists, but I also, if you guys have questions, please just raise your hand. Michael's got the mic. He's gonna be the runner to make sure we can keep this as interactive as possible. So let's start with a quick intro. Michael, kind of come across. Just give everybody a quick background.
Sure. I'm Michael Ducy. I work at Sysdig as Director of Community. I mainly focus on our open source projects, one of which is Falco, that Loris mentioned in his opening. Falco is runtime security, so helping you in that stack that Ann showed. How do you provide security and more detection around abnormal events that might be happening inside of your containers? Have a big background in the DevOps space, worked for Chef for a number of years as well. So kind of understand automation and DevOps and what we're trying to go through with this transformation.
Cool. Hey, I'm Daniel from Red Hat, Senior Product Manager in the OpenShift business unit. I'm product managing something we call Operator Framework, which you might have heard of. I was actually happy to see Falco join the crowd on Operator Hub.io. So we are building out an ecosystem of Kubernetes operators so people can put in operational knowledge into workloads running autonomously on that platform. And we have several engineering teams in our engineering organization looking after several components that eventually make up this framework, which is an open source community project in the Kubernetes umbrella.
Hey, I'm Josh. So I work more on the field side of things. So since like Kubernetes 1.4, I've been helping large organizations architect and implement Kubernetes as kind of their orchestration piece of their platform puzzle. So that's been really cool. I worked at CoreOS for about a year and a half and Red Hat for like a nanosecond, and then moved over to Heptio. And since the acquisition with VMware, I'm now part of VMware, still doing field-oriented work. And yeah, with this panel, I'm really excited to be talking to you all.
So I guess if you want your company to get acquired, hire Josh.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're 2 for 2, or me, because I've been through a few of them as well, so it always worked out well. So I want to start first with some of the challenges in cloud native transformation, right? We all know that our organizations want and have to move to be digital, more digital, and everybody's trying to figure out how much of that goes to cloud, how much of that stays on-prem, multi-cloud, et cetera. And there's a few challenges that I think are interesting. I'd like the panelists to take a little bit on that. And to me, I think one of the first challenges that I see is how do you align this concept of cloud native transformation with the business? Take it from a business perspective first, because I think it's a business driver that is enabling what we do. How are organizations either addressing or struggling with some of that business alignment when it comes to cloud native?
So I'll jump in. So I'm a big fan of the State of DevOps report that's been around for a long time. Puppet initially sponsored it, and now I believe it's done through Google. And it's DevOps Research Associates are the ones who have put it out, Nicole Forsgren and a few others, Jez Humble in that space. And they lay out very, very clearly what the business benefits of DevOps is. So why am I talking about DevOps and we're supposed to be talking about cloud native transformation? The cloud native component is just the technology that we're deciding to use underneath those principles and ideas of DevOps. They're still the same kind of concepts that we're talking about around automation and how do we shift things left, how do we make things more lean. And I think that's a great tool to use to actually lay out those business benefits, that there are real impacts to the bottom line for a company. And if you can lay out what those business impacts are, that you can ship faster, you can respond to customers faster, you can make more money more quickly, I think is the language that business people understand, right?
Right. And I think it's I think we all know it instinctively, but how do you find some of those right value drivers actually for the business? And that's a great source to go to in this case.
And I think on that front, one thing that I run into a lot in the field is, once you've gotten that buy-in initially, whether it be bottom line driven or something else, you've got the company behind it, there's kind of this initial period where you're going through the transformation. And I think it's really high value to try to keep your scope somewhat small and deliver on some of those visions in a small way early on. I've had a lot of folks, especially when adopting a technology like Kubernetes, try to really boil the ocean and say, we're going to re-architect on all of this stuff. We're going to make the most flawless platform ever in the entire world. And then as months and months go on, and the stakeholders are going, so how's that bottom line going? How's that enhancement, that agility going? And everyone's like, we're almost there. And then that leads into 2 years. You can very easily kind of do the inverse of what you set out to do, right?
And that iteration idea that Brandon talked about, right?
Brandon talked about this in his session about minimal viable change. Right? Not worry about MVP as minimal viable product, but think about it as what's those minimal viable change and making those small little iterations of change that allows you to track and show some success along the way.
Totally, yep.
Yeah, I think we've seen the same on the adoption side of Kubernetes, right? So it primarily starts with the easy or low-hanging fruit, which are like the stateless workloads that you can easily hold over to the platform or you can extract from your existing architecture. And that has now matured over a couple of years in the community. What we see now is that there's definitely a trend to bring in the platform as a whole to everything that's out there, right? So there are some people that say that Kubernetes is a platform for just stateless workloads, and I tend to disagree with that a little bit because when you see where the project came from, right, the blueprint that made it possible, the Borg platform within Google, it runs all kinds of workloads, right? Also stateful workloads. So I think by the very architecture aspect of that, it's really there for the entire landscape. And we're seeing some very interesting trends in the community as well as in the industry to get there, among of them which are operators, but also other things.
Right. Yeah, we'll talk about some technology stuff in a little bit. Are you seeing cultural clash as you're making this shift? Where are some of those kind of rubs with the existing culture and the new culture? Where are you seeing some of that overlap? Because I think that's one of the other big challenges through any time you do a transformation project is you got an old way of thinking, you got a new way. Where do those clashes happen? What are you seeing with some of your folks in the field?
Yeah, so there is definitely some rubbing, right, as you would expect with these kind of disruptive changes. One thing in particular as a pattern that I've seen on some customers is that they are basically forming an entire new team and plant this as an island in the existing organization, right? There's now this DevOps teams, which is hugely empowered.
A new silo.
A new silo, exactly. And these people are usually empowered and have pretty great freedom in what they can do, right? But they essentially sideline the rest of the organization. So this has been either top-down driven or it has just emerged out of pure necessity because the other teams couldn't deliver on the same pace and the same speed as these teams would like. And then they have taken on actually managing IT infrastructure, which they were never destined to do and were never looking to do in the first place, right? So I think it takes some time usually to get around to this stage and to realize, okay, now we have to get the rest of the organization on board as well.
Yeah, because I think the challenge in that approach, there's pros and cons, right? The pro is I can bring in a culture that understands DevOps and understands the value of speed, agility, portability, et cetera. And you put them in, you let them go, and they accomplish a task. To your point, don't try to boil the ocean. They go out and they build a component of the organization and show that it can work. Now the challenge, I think, is how does that team now help to educate the rest of the organization to move them over to this new way of thinking and developing code? Because that's the next big hurdle. Even with that small team in place that's been successful, it doesn't mean that the entire organization's been transformed.
And to that point that you made, I want to double down on the idea that there's this kind of team that goes in and kind of gets put in the middle of all the organization, right? And they own this new transformation, this new platform, and I see that all the time. And I think on a specific level, 2 areas of the organizations I usually see that cause the most rub, and not to, not trying to bash these areas, but it's usually in security and networking are the 2 that I oftentimes see kind of having a huge rub when these new platforms come on. It's like, what do you mean now I have a bunch of containers with potential CVs that I need to worry about? What do you mean I have all these ephemeral IP addresses that are always changing? Like, I need to filter based on source IP, where my traffic's going, and that's my network security model. And, it's kind of this push and pull, if you will. It's like, to what degree can you educate and say, here's a more, I don't know if you want to call it modern, but let's say cloud native approach to doing X, Y, and Z, and here's the value add of taking this approach, right? And then there's the other side, which is oftentimes you have to give a little bit, right? I guess this kind of goes back to boiling the ocean, but sometimes there's compromise, like, we'll make our platform, be it Kubernetes or something, run slightly differently to meet these legacy requirements in the interim, right? Let's just make small little steps going forward. So a lot of my job personally when I'm in the field is doing kind of exactly what you just described, where we're just working on that kind of siloed team and just figuring out where should we focus on educating and where should we give a little bit to make sure we don't put a bad taste in everyone's mouth, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and on the idea of educating and kind of, so we create this DevOps team, and then the DevOps team or cloud native team or whatever we want to call it, the Kubernetes platform team, they go and build the platform or they build the tooling and everything, but then they have to get the broader organization to adopt it, right? And one thing that I've seen be really, really successful is treat your internal community just like you run external communities. So you need to build the exact same community that you see here at KubeCon and all these other events where you're interacting, you're able to send in pull requests, you see the maintainers, you do the contributor summit, all of those sorts of things. You need to be running those internally. So you need to have your own KubeCon or your own DevOps days or whatever it might be in your organization. Get your teams together, make it something that can be either in person or do it remote and do an online conference or something like that. And another concept that's been really popular is the concept of dojos, which came from Target, and Verizon has been doing them as well in the US. And this is essentially where you have the DevOps team, you have other teams come in, and for 4 to 8 weeks, that other team works on a project, and they basically get to use all this new tooling that the DevOps team or the platform team has built for them. They learn how to use it, and then they go back into their respective groups, and then now they're actually enabled, they know how to use the tools, they know how to use Kubernetes, they know how to use the platform and consume it, and then they can go back and actually start developing their apps towards that new platform that's been built.
Got it. So we're going to start to break in. I want to get into some of the details around challenges, people process technology challenges across both the DevOps team, and we're going to talk security as well. Because I think, Josh, to your earlier point, security is one of the big pushbacks in a lot of organizations. A lot of security professionals came out of networking, so that's maybe why you see it as well, is because the way we've instinctively thought about our world is an IP address and how do you protect it and ingress, egress, and all this other stuff. In a containerized world, as we move to microservices and distribution of our environments, this is so much harder to deal with. And I don't think networking guys, IT in general, or the security guys have fully wrapped their heads around what does containerization in this move to a highly distributed microservice application look like? Because it's not just a single URI anymore with a single server and a single monolithic piece of code. It is a URI that now has access to multiple API endpoints distributed on-prem or in multi-cloud, all communicating. You now have containers that are sitting on hosts that never hit the TCP/IP stack because they can communicate internally from the actual nodes that they're running on, which means you have no traffic visibility into node-to-node communication on the same host, for example. I mean, these are concepts that most IT and security folks haven't truly wrapped their heads around. So how are organizations attempting to bring security along, and how to try to integrate them into the existing DevOps process that I might have built as a start, maybe as a small team? How are you seeing that? Are you seeing some success there? I still pound my head off a wall every time I sit in front of a bunch of security practitioners because they still don't get it. But are you seeing some of those moves, and what are you seeing there?
I definitely am. I think people are starting to get a little bit wiser, and both in our realm of the cloud native practice and getting security involved a lot earlier, right? Because a lot of this it's a, sorry to be cliche, but it is really a journey, right? And bringing people along for that journey early on and working through those potential problems, potential pushbacks will get you along so that when you're a week away from this new platform going live, you're not just trying to solve all these potential issues or concerns that other folks might have. So I think from our end, it's really just about adjusting to getting people involved earlier on. And I will say, just looking back 3 years ago implementing Kubernetes, it has gotten so much better already, so much better, right? And maybe I've just seen better customers over time, but genuinely I think it's just people evolving and thinking, and it's a slow change. Our focus is containers and orchestration and automation, and these other folks have a whole nother realm of things to worry about, right?
Yeah, like inventory of what's
Yeah,
authorized and unauthorized, compliance, right? Because
Right.
compliance is a driver still for them.
Right.
How am I going to monitor this new environment?
Yeah,
right?
so on that front, I think the last thing I'd say about it, I think it behooves us to have empathy on both sides of the equation, genuinely. I mean, you have to understand that they're not there always to just provide absolute friction for what you're trying to do. They're, at the end of the day, potentially on the line for security vulnerabilities and things that might come out. And then on our end, them having a little bit of empathy of we're trying to help with agility and impact the bottom line over time with these new platforms. We're not trying to make their job harder either. So it's really good, I think, to have empathy on both sides and just make it a journey that we go through together.
I think you hit on a very important point, which was actually bringing the security guy into the meeting from the first day, right? So I think this is a practice that has shown good success, and then also getting these guys to wrap their head around some of the new concepts that we are establishing here, which is primarily just increasing velocity, right? As you said, we don't have a single IP anymore, like a single endpoint where I can afford to put a human against it and worry about that manually and by himself. Now we need to transition over to a much more declarative approach where a lot of automation is taking care of this, and then the security folks become the advisor and the authors of these automation cookbooks that essentially bake in the automation and the security that comes with it into the platform, ideally from day one, right? So also on the receiving side of this, on the DevOps team side, which just want to move fast, you need to establish that you just can't pull any arbitrary image from Docker Hub, right? It needs to be scanned, it needs to be vetted, it needs to have the right permissions. You shouldn't run root on your Kubernetes cluster either, right? So some very basic and very easy to achieve security housekeeping is something that we can teach DevOps teams as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the shifts we'll see from a security perspective is, like I said, a lot of us came out of the networking space. I'm an old guy. I came out of networking. I mean, we were doing Cisco routing and checkpoint and PIX firewalls. That's how I learned security way back in the day. And so you have a lot of people from a security perspective that came out of the networking side. What I think we're going to see is a trend where security is more on the development side, where the developers in this room who really want to embrace security are going to be the enablers, because it's an integration capability, I think, of how security ultimately comes into the CI/CD pipeline. It's a set of integrations at various checkpoints along the pipeline, and those developers that know how to integrate not only products but integrate data into those tool sets really sets their organization up to really shift security even further left into the process, where it's now baked into the process, and automation steps are going along the way. And so I think the developers in this room have a fantastic opportunity to kind of drive some of that security enablement.
And I think the platform and the cloud native world is definitely helping that, right? Like the operator framework and this concept of operators. You can now deploy something to your Kubernetes cluster, and you can have the security paradigms that you need baked into it. And the security team can make sure that every single time I deploy a MySQL cluster using an operator, that it has TLS turned on, it has all of the security requirements that you need to actually run it. And I think that becomes a very powerful thing of as the platform enables security best practices.
Yeah, and I think my prediction back when I wrote the 5-year strat plan for Tenable, it was the end of 2015, looking where are we going to be in 2020, is I made a prediction that the role of security moves away from an operational role more to a governance role, to your point. Is TLS enabled? Is my Kubernetes environment configured correctly? Do I have the right models in place with my cloud providers based on the shared responsibility model? That's more of a governance role than it is an operational role. Ops still exists, but the question of where DevOps and SecOps hands off is going to be an interesting one, because you're pulling a ton of telemetry out of your applications on the DevOps side, right? Because you guys want to understand application performance, CPU, memory, et cetera. I just see security data as another layer of those kind of metrics coming out that now get integrated in, and where that SecOps component lives, whether it's separate or not, I think also kind of gets a little clouded as we move forward.
And one thing too, I'll say it's related to all this, is it's the security aspect of a lot of the areas where we work is, in my opinion, like the most exciting right now. I mean, like the tooling that's come, like Falco, like different things that are coming out. A lot of folks for the longest time have been running these systems, as you said, like with their containers as root. Pod security policies are something that you would be so surprised how many clusters do not use those. It is insane, right? And unless you're running something like OpenShift or Enterprise PKS or some type of like, just distribution that sets these defaults, a lot of folks genuinely just don't know about them. So I think for the first time over these last maybe years, but mostly year, we're starting to see tools like Falco and different monitoring detection tools that are really exposing a lot of the areas we probably should have been more focused on. So I think there's going to be this really good blend of the security and, like you said, kind of bringing in the development side too, to really make these kind of rigorous systems that we can get more visibility into and be more secure with. So it's a really exciting space right now.
Yeah, one of the craziest things I saw when we were watching kind of this evolution into containers. So again, I probably made the first acquisition in the container space when Tenable bought FlawCheck back in 2016. And why did we buy that solution? We knew our limitations, right? We scanned endpoints. We didn't really understand the container world, and we made that acquisition knowing that we needed capabilities on the containerization side to understand vulnerabilities in containers that weren't going to use a Nessus scanner, for example. But what we saw at the time from a competition perspective was this crazy concept that, all right, I'm used to agents. Well, I can put an agent potentially in my cluster, but it has limited visibility. And so what we started to see was this proliferation of privileged containers, right? Basically giving the container root to allow it to have access back to the kernel to monitor the Linux process, which is what containers are running on. And I'm like, what are we doing? I mean, we haven't rethought the problem in some respects. We were just trying to apply old techniques and said, well, we'll just give it privileges and boom, there it goes. I think now with Falco and other solutions, we now see that the danger of giving up root in a container, I mean the runC vulnerability earlier this year, even aspects of what was happening with Meltdown and Spectre had some impacts when you think about the impact of potential giving up root access on your devices. Are we going to continue to see that shift of locking this stuff down and getting better about how we deal with root level containers?
I definitely think so.
Okay. Because you've got Core OS in the portfolio and some other stuff too. I'm just curious from a Red Hat perspective.
Well, we were always very vocal about not running as root, even on your operating system, on your classical server, right? So we were also very vocal about things like C Linux, bringing a default declarative security model to the user space, right? For sure, I mean, that is actually something that we sometimes get picked on a little bit in terms of friction on the platform itself. Like why can't I just run my binary? Why can't I just run that container? What's that error message? What's the security context constraint anyway, or pod security policy these days, right? These are all concepts that we saw very, very early in the life of Kubernetes and Linux itself, right? And said this stuff needs to be kind of contained and regulated. There are certain use cases though where you need elevated privileges. That is not to say you're completely root on the system, but you get like an additional capability, like you get to read from that socket or you get to touch that particular device, right? But nothing outside of that. And I think this is where Kubernetes is really an interesting platform because of its goal-seeking, resilient nature. It constantly makes sure that certain declarations are actually matching reality, which to your point is the heart of the operator pattern, right? It's basically saying, here's a set of rules, go make these rules happen and watch over time if they stay in place. And that's exactly what an operator is doing, right? It's nothing else than a custom controller that's implementing certain policies. And if the policy says have TLS enabled, and the user goes directly to the object, disables it, 5 seconds later, the operator will reconcile that and change it back, right? So that's where we see security becoming baked into the system.
Right. Yeah, kind of that self-healing automation component.
Right, because it becomes way too much to worry about forcing a human, forcing an ops process, or for any kind of tooling that sits outside of the system and tries to impose itself. It needs to be part of the architecture itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just kind of add that I see sandboxing as kind of the way that we're going to start solving a lot of these security problems. Mainly because part of the challenge with pod security policies and capabilities and SE Linux and AppArmor is that there are so many tunables. And if you don't know what all of those different tunables are that you can set and change, then it just becomes too difficult. And that's why I think in a lot of cases people just don't turn it on.
Yeah.
We actually have an open source project called to do a shameless plug for one of our open source projects called the Pod Security Policy Advisor. And it helps you kind of define what those rules are and what you want to set. But if I go into this mode where, well, I can just sandbox things off and you can prevent ever getting that level of access to the host operating system,
Yeah.
then I think most people would probably just go down that route of moving back into a hypervisor type mode or gvisor or something like that.
Yeah, and I mean, sandboxing has its pros and cons. It will add probably some overhead, but the ability to monitor what the container is doing, what it normally communicates with, and then simple white and blacklisting, right? As much as we talk about the good and the bad about whitelists and blacklists, they still have their purpose. And in a sandbox environment where I know that these containers are running these processes or these different system calls or communicating to these other containers, the ability to enforce that now create some preventive controls in place to enforce behavior. There's some advantages there, even though you're going to take a little bit of a hit probably from a CPU memory footprint, but gives you some isolation so that you don't get kind of that east-west transition, that lateral movement in the environment. Because with containers, it's even harder to see some of that versus just think about the challenges we have with lateral detection in our environments from a user perspective in a normal network, let alone before we add in a bunch of container microservice architecture. Some technology trends. Last year, this conference was all about the service mesh. Right? It was. I mean, we went service mesh happy last year. I unfortunately can't stay the next couple days, but I'm curious kind of what's going to be the message coming out of this KubeCon? What do you think some of those interesting trends or areas that are going to be presented this week?
I think service mesh won't stop anytime soon. I think we're starting to have some conversations about whether you actually need a service mesh and understanding whether you're trying to solve a problem that you may or may not actually have at the moment. And then when you bring a solution on like service mesh, how many new problems you're potentially creating for yourself, right? I have nothing against service meshes. It's trade-offs that we usually don't talk about. I mean, I think a problem we have in our industry in general is just we sell the bill of pros and aren't transparent about the cons sometimes, and it just causes us a nightmare in the long run. But that wasn't your question, just a rant for a moment.
But I appreciate the rant
Sure.
because, again, last year was all about the service mesh.
Totally. But I think this year, I'm actually not super certain. I going back to what we were just talking about, I really hope it's a lot of things around like Falco-oriented products, like things that are focusing on giving us some more visibility to the security layer, because I feel like it's an area that we've kind of dismissed a little bit over time, especially in the Kubernetes ecosystem, and it's finally coming to light that like we should probably do something about this or else we'll be in a world of trouble in the long run. So that's what I'm hoping for, but I'm really not sure.
I would agree with you. I think the service mesh is something that we continue to talk about. Another trend that we are seeing is the whole scale to zero architecture type style. So Knative is quickly maturing, also with the help of Google and Red Hat and others. So we bake that into the platform as well as another way to run applications and essentially be more event-driven in the way you will process requests to your architecture. I still think from a personal point of view that like getting the idea of applications or Kubernetes native applications will still mature. So to come back to the operator ecosystem, we saw a lot of growth there, and we saw a lot of people jumping onto that bandwagon and write operators, but there's still a lot of learnings in what makes a proper operator from a pattern perspective and what we can actually think of an operator capable of doing, right? So we developed this capability or maturity model, if you will, where we start from the left, where the operator is just basically installing something. So it's a little bit better than the template, basically, right?
Yeah.
And then it starts to support updates, which is, again, very, very important to enforce security. As part of the operator framework, we basically advocate people that they turn on auto updates for their operators and therefore for the managed applications as well. And this maturity level goes all the way back to the level 5, which we call autopilot, where the operator is taking much more data like metering or also security data into account and basically takes on actions based on this data coming in. So I think there's a lot more to learn about that pattern, and we're just at the beginning where we start to think about, okay, how does this thing come onto the cluster, right? It's a pretty privileged application if you think about it. An operator can basically create almost any kind of object in any kind of namespace, right? So, and this is how it has been before we thought about getting some more lifecycle into this. So now we basically tailor the operator's permissions to the very bare minimum that it actually needs, and we actually also tailor it per the namespace in which it gets deployed so that you can still have a level of isolation, at least at the namespace or project level, if something is compromised on that level.
So interesting trend in the security space, which you just hit on a little bit, which I want to go back to in a second, is around orchestration automation on the security side. But we've always seen it at the end of the security cycle, primarily in incident response, right? An alert comes in, somebody has to evaluate the alert, and then you use orchestration automation tools to actually automate kind of the incident response and remediation side. What you just talked about a little bit, though, is being a little more orchestration automation focused on the front end, right? By leveraging operators in the OpenShift world, you now potentially have ways to automate aspects of patching as soon as a vulnerability is detected and a patch comes out. It's not a reactive component as much as it is a preventative component. And that's a mind shift as well around orchestration automation. We do it well, I think, in the traditional DevOps process around orchestrating and automating aspects of the build and everything else. If we can move security there as well, that really gives us that embedded security into the application easily concept that doesn't really exist in organizations, at least the way I see them today.
Yeah, one thing you have to keep in mind is that what the CNCF is doing here is giving you a lot of building blocks, right? And so a lot of what we hear about at KubeCon and other events are basically small components that you can then take together as part of a bigger system to build kind of this self-healing infrastructure and other components like that. So what I find is actually pretty interesting is like when we start to think about what service mesh can do, or we start to think about what operators can do, it really starts to provide these building blocks where you can start building this self-healing infrastructure to when there is a security incident, the operators can automatically update to the right version. The service mesh can handle putting load into that new cluster of application that you've stood up automatically with the operator, and lots of those concepts. And the other area that I think that we haven't really looked at too much, but I would encourage everyone to start to think about this is, how can I use tools like Knative or these serverless frameworks for doing operations and automation tasks? It's very easy for you as an operator of a platform to go and define a function, put that function up into Knative, and then that function can actually respond to things in your environment. It's available via an API, so like if you want to write an admission controller, probably one of the easiest ways to write an admission controller is to spin up a function, put it in Knative, and now you have it available as an admission controller for you. There's lots of little tasks that you can do with these functions, especially around incident response and having events come in, being able to query the environment, enhance events with more metadata and other things like that. And that's actually something that we talk about a lot in the Falco world, but we haven't seen too much of it out in the ecosystem, and I would like to see more of it.
So would we.
It's a trend, maybe in my own head.
We hope it's a trend anyways. All right, I got a couple smart guys up here. Any questions from the audience while I got them up here? Michael will do the running and answer questions along the way if you have any. You guys hungry for lunch? I see lunch is in the back, so if you're hungry, I get it. It's okay.
At least somebody from Sysdig ask a question.
All right. Thank you, panelists.
Oh, here we go. Wait.
Oh, wait. Oh, we got a question. Good.
You felt sorry
Awkward
for us.
silence almost got us.
Hey, just a quick question. I think one of the things that we see as we kind of head into cloud native is the volume of tooling that's out there. How do you see governance models around the introduction of that tooling?
It was hard to hear the question.
It was hard
for
to
me,
hear
sorry.
it a little bit. Yeah, can you relay for us, Mike?
Yeah, so the question was, there's so much tooling, and I think Brandon talked about it earlier today when he talked. And this idea, like you have all this tooling out there, how do you rationalize what tools you should be using and what governance models do you put in place to start making decisions about what tooling we bring in? So I would say one thing that's very useful around this is what the work the CNCF is doing and having this concept of sandbox projects, incubating projects, graduated projects. So you know that this open source software is well maintained and putting a lot of the best practices in place. And I think this is one of the things that we kind of miss as to why the CNCF is here is this process of, as an enterprise, you should be confident that you can bring in this open source software and it has everything that you need. And you can use it with confidence and not fear of not knowing when a vulnerability is released or something like that. But I'll let you both add in.
Yeah, I think a lot of our job nowadays is to be kind of like the Indiana Jones of like the massive CNCF landscape slide. You can imagine all those squares everywhere real quick. It's very intimidating and scary. And yeah, I think to your point about confidence in that project, a lot of times it's really just communicating with folks and teams about what they're taking on by taking on a technology, right? And it kind of goes back to the idea of just not being so focused on only the pros, but also the reality of it. So, understanding when you're looking at these projects, is it owned by a single vendor, right? If it's mostly community driven, how healthy is the community? And obviously, GitHub stars are the most important thing in the world, so that's just a joke. But you should be able to see, like, are they responding to issues? What has the health been? How long has it been around? I'm a big fan, and this sometimes gets me in trouble, of trying to push for some more battle-tested software in the CNCF landscape over what's new and shiny. An example, I think, of this would be, and hopefully this won't get me in trouble, I really love where Cilium is headed, but I have seen Calico deployments in so many massive clusters. I feel very, very confident in its ability at this point. But I'm going to track the Cilium project very, very closely because what they're doing with eBPF is extremely compelling. So it's just really having that kind of honesty with yourself of like, if stuff hits the fan, do I feel comfortable with the support I'm going to get out of this potential open source project, right? So hopefully that helps a little bit.
A part of what you're doing is bringing a bunch of these tools together into the OpenShift platform to make it easier for people to manage across all these different potential projects, right?
That's the business model, right? So
Yeah.
I guess if you are looking to adopt this technology in the production environment, my first question would come to mind, is there a commercial support model behind that? Is there someone I can call when something goes wrong, right? It's nice when you tinker with this and you're play in your sandbox environment and you develop a prototype, that's all good. But as soon as people's salaries are on the line, there needs to be at least a single vendor or ideally multiple, right, from the community perspective that backs this project, that is able to take on the load and that is also able to give you the ingress point for feedback from production environments like yours, right? So there tends to be sometimes a model where there's a very puristic view of things, right? And I can certainly admit that also we are sometimes guilty of that, of saying this is the way to go and it only needs to work like this, right? So I think engaging with a healthy community, and this goes back to the earlier discussion we had around how do we bring the rest of the IT organization to that. Engaging with the community to me is key to this, right? So ask other users, watch for the healthiness of the project, bounce off your ideas from partners and competitors in that space, even at conferences like this. I think this is the best part about this whole CNCF ecosystem, is that it is an open source community, and we're all here in the same room talking about these things, openly sharing experiences and opinions, and that's how you basically shape your own opinion and make up your mind whether or not to take on this new route or not.
And if I could say something on that real quick, I think the latter point that you made about, those of you who are using these technologies inside of your companies, I think I'm part of a vendor, so I'm going to down the vendors for a moment here. I think the company-to-company interaction could be stronger. It's like, instead of just having conversations with VMware or with Red Hat about what you're using, talk to Zalando Tech, talk to Ticketmaster, talk to all these companies who have been shepherding Kubernetes for a really long time, because it's those experiences where you're going to get really good, true feedback about how X, Y, and Z is happening and what technologies they've taken on, and also where they've gotten burned as well. So I hope over time we'll start being more open from a user-to-user standpoint about our pain points and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting advantages for the open source community has been the adoption by the commercials. What Red Hat's done, what VMware's done, but now under IBM, under Microsoft, there is more embrace, which means that more and more of these open source projects are going to get more and more commercialized support. I think what you guys have to figure out is who are your key vendors and what tools are they using to pull all that together so that you can kind of have a way to bring all those things together and still get all the benefits from open source, but also get some of that commercial support you're going to need in your enterprise environments as you move forward. Got another one? Ooh, see? All you need is one, and then it spurs the discussion.
We'll keep going. All right, so my only disconnect that I get, right, so we're in the right place, the open source community is moving forward, right? But really, the pieces that we're not really linking is the business itself, right? One of the major resistances that I found out there for embracing open source is that the business community itself don't understand most of the technology that is coming from all of these CNCF projects, right? They feel fear to actually embrace any of this because they really don't know how far they're going to go with it, right? And then at the same time, you're talking about now experience with customers embracing it, moving forward with new use cases. But I guess the open source community also should be approaching the business community, right, with some sort of best practices or something that we can showcase to them that this is actually works for them, right, that is worth it to invest on all of these technologies. That's really my comment more than a question.
Yeah, so I'll do this because I think this goes back to the vendor concept, and since I don't work for a vendor anymore, I can say this. This is where I think the commercial vendors can really help, is because they're embracing these projects that are available as open source in the CNCF and putting commercial support around them, which takes some of the risk away of implementing some of these tools as standalone. Look, you guys can roll your own. You guys are smart enough to do it. You love playing with new technology. I get it. But there is a risk associated sometimes in some of these projects on what kind of support you're going to get if you roll your own. That's where I think the advantage of some of the commercial vendors really help us embrace the open source projects that are in CNCF with that added benefit of support and other things. And that just de-risks it for an organization, I think, to make it easier to adopt some of these technologies.
And then there are some initiatives. There's one called the Cii Best Practices. I want to say it's the Core Infrastructure Initiative is what it stands for, and it's from the Linux Foundation. It's an open source project that's all around making sure that an open source project has a lot of the best practices that you expect in a code base. The same way that you would have in a commercial vendor, having things like static code scanning and other things like that. And that's actually one of the requirements. The CNCF actually does a really good job of shepherding projects through that and making sure that they're getting the best practices badge to make sure that the projects are almost treated like they are commercial software.
Yeah, and I know we're going to see more of a focus on the supply chain when it comes to not only the tools, but also other components of open source. I know the government's working, specifically the U.S. federal government's working on the concept of a software bill of materials. It's going to be a requirement to identify all the components that are embedded in software before they get adopted by the federal government, for example. I think we're going to see commercial evolutions of aspects of that. But you're going to see a lot more about this whole supply chain component. And I think, again, the commercial entities potentially have a little bit of a leg up because they can wrap some of the additional stability around some of these open source projects, which would bring them up into a higher trust level, I think, in the supply chain at some point. So we'll see how some of that plays out, but I think we're going to see a lot more on supply chain and software bill of materials.
One additional aspect I wanted to throw into this is that obviously there's the commercial side and providing commercial support to it, and maybe the initial investment to get it up in higher quality, but also really take a hard look at the vendor of your choice, how much they're contributing back to the open source project, right? So to me, this is one of the number one gauges to tell if that is a long-term relationship or not, right? Really look at the code stats, at the commit statistics, at the variety of the community in the ecosystem, and see if your vendor is there and is actively contributing back to the product he's actually providing support for, right? This will put them in a very good position to actually do that. Fix things upstream, because we all know if it's not an upstream, it's a fork, right? And you don't want to run on a fork. You want to run on the community-backed power there that forces, that unites itself under the CNCF.
Yeah, and all the CNCF projects, if you're not aware, they all have what's called a DevStats dashboard. So if you just search for CNCF DevStats, you can actually go and see who's committing to what projects, what the commit velocity is, and how long issues are staying open and other things like that. So it's a good tool to use to kind of judge that.
Awesome. Oh, good, another question.
So all these tools and tool chains are really amazing, but they fall sometimes into open source licensing where cloud vendors can actually take the tool and make like a product from that tool and make you kind of get into that vendor because of the advantage of using open source behind the scenes. Do you think that there's going to be some licensing or some changes on the license that could kind of prevent this?
Licensing of open source, and by embedding certain types of licenses into your code.
You know, the whole recent Redis debacle and Mongo, and I think Elastic is now the latest, where if people aren't familiar, just fill everyone in. So a lot of open source vendors have been changing their licenses so that AWS and others can't embed it into an AWS service. And so the question is do you think the licensing trend is going to continue in that way where we can't embed open source in a cloud provider or something like that?
So I can't speak to the actual intricacies of the licenses specifically, but I have a hope of where it will go. Sorry, I'll give you a hope instead of a direct answer. I hope we're moving more towards a model where vendors have to earn your business, not through lock-in, but through providing value, such that the way the licenses are set up and the way that all these things work is effectively when there's enterprise-oriented support around something, it is extremely easy for you to turn the enterprise bits off and just continue business as usual with the pure upstream open source project. And that puts the onus on us, Red Hat, VMware, and others, Microsoft, to continue actually providing value, because at the end of the day, you could drop us at any point if you need to, right? We have to show you value. And, as far as the intricacies of just being able to sweep an open source project up and make it a managed offering and maybe or possibly contribute back if you want to, that's probably a deeper discussion that requires lawyers, and I don't really understand that end of things.
Yeah, when you have a bunch of resources, money, and you can just throw bodies of money at it and do it, yes.
I think you're hitting a crux of a huge point that we're at right now. I'm just not really sure what direction to take it, honestly.
Yeah, I've been seeing the same. It's an unfortunate thing, I think, for open source, because you have these parties that basically just suck up all the value but don't provide anything back. That's why I was so pushing for look at your vendor and look how much they are putting back into the community, look at their upstream activities and their open source governance model as well. Many of them actually publicize them on their website. And we've certainly been working with many partners, but also customers to embrace proper open source governance and embrace open source as a development model, right? So not only we have now partners like Sysdig participating in that, but we also have customers who say, we want to be active upstream, right? And we want to have an open source governance model, and we want to be open source by default. And that has been a long way coming. So it would be really sad to see that going away again with some single vendors monopolizing their position. But on the other hand, you see there's a market, right? So we see on our side many more operators popping up from these kind of vendors who see their lunch being taken away because there are other vendors that just use their code but don't contribute back, right? So they're the more incentivized to actually write very, very high quality operators to bring that managed service experience onto every Kubernetes cluster, right? As a pure open source project, and then provide a commercial support envelope around that, right? So for the end user, for you, right, as the customer, this is a win situation because you get to have this thing that was before stuck in somebody's dashboard. You get that to move around, and you get to actually have that on your laptop as well, right? So I think there are some positive sides to that, but yeah.
I think the pressures will come from the other two cloud providers because I think they are much more open to embracing open source and committing back. And I think it's going to be the two of them that drive probably the rest of the industry.
Ends up driving the behavior of the
Absolutely.
others. And I think right now it's just a defensive measure that I feel like the companies like Elastic and Redis and Mongo just don't know what else to do about how they can protect their business while still maintaining the open source.
Yeah, that's where I think Google and Microsoft will play a bigger role in this as we move forward, just because of their embrace now of open source, probably more than Amazon has been in the past. So we'll see. All right. Thank you, panelists, Daniel, Josh, Michael, for sitting up here with me and taking my abuse. And with that, it's time for our networking lunch. So lunch is in the back. So grab your lunch, spend some time networking with folks. We'll come back at 1:20.